And we're just about approaching the top of the hour, I just want to say that this is co-sponsored by both the Northeast Educational Effectiveness Research Alliance and the Urban School Improvement Alliance, both alliances working with the REL NEI. And with that, I am going to hand over to Karen Shackman, who is going to begin the presentation of the session. Karen, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. I'd like to welcome everyone today to our session. As I was following the polls and seeing the responses, I can see that we have a wide range of participants, people who attended the first session in logic models, those who didn't, people who are quite familiar with logic models and those who are not so familiar, folks who have a lot of experience with conducting program evaluation, and folks who are new to it. So we hope that for all of you there will be some piece of this presentation today that will reach you where you are and give you something that you need to move forward. With that, I just want to call your attention a little bit to what you're looking at on your screen. You'll see the attendees in the bottom left corner, followed by the chat. The chat is very important and useful. We'll be asking you to use the chat with any questions you have, as well as pulling up several chats over the course of today's workshop for you to enter in information as we ask you to do it. So just be aware that while this workshop does not have an oral component for you, there's a lot of opportunity for you to comment via the chats that we'll provide. You'll also see the downloadable files in the bottom of your screen. So if you don't have the workbook, you should download that and have that available to you as we move through. So with that, I will get started. My name is Karen Shackman, and I work for the Regional Educational Laboratory Northeast and Islands. And Shayla Rodriguez and I will be presenting today. You've already heard from Andrew Seeger and from Vicki in lieu of Susan Mundry, who was unable to join us today, but they are both the facilitators of some of the alliances that the Regional Educational Laboratory Northeast and Islands run. With that, let me dive right into today. So as some of you or many of you may know, this is the second workshop in a series. Here we will reintroduce logic models, but we will not provide the overview of logic models as we did in the first session where we walked through each of the elements of the model. We're going to assume some basic working knowledge of logic models for those who are attending this session. And you'll see in the top left corner that there is a logic model template that Shayla will be walking you through a little bit. But that's just to help guide you as we work through the workshop. The logic model is a tool that we use for developing program evaluation, and so we want you to have kind of a picture of it in your mind as you go through. So our goals for today are to reintroduce you to logic models, to practice using logic models as a tool for developing evaluation questions and indicators of success, and to provide you with some guidance and some tools that you can use when you begin to determine the appropriate evaluation questions and the type of evaluation you might want to do for a given program or initiative. I'll stop there and say that we're hoping that you will walk through this workshop with a particular program or policy in mind that you might be thinking about as we ask you to engage in these activities. So just take a moment in your mind to think about, well, what is a program or a policy that I would like to be thinking about as I walk through each of these activities. So the agenda for today. We're in the middle of the welcome and overview, and at many stages of the workshop, like I said, we'll be asking you to contribute your thinking to the session. So be prepared as we move through, either to draw on the case examples that we'll provide or your own program or policy as we move through. We'll begin with Shayla reviewing logic models briefly, then I'll jump in and talk about evaluation generally. Then we'll start to talk about how we move from logic models to evaluation questions. Spend a fair amount of time thinking about how you generate indicators, building on what you've done in a logic model. Then we'll talk a bit about the very basics of building an evaluation design. This is not a highly technical workshop. That would be a different workshop, but in a general way, thinking about evaluation design, and then close with a little bit about how you might put these pieces together. Shayla.
Thank you, Karen. So I'm just going to go and just take a moment and do a quick review on logic models. As some of you attended our first session and will remember this from that session on developing logic models. So here, logic models are a great, great representation of the theory of change that drives the program of policy, and it also creates a kind of framework upon which the program might be developed, implemented, and evaluated. We also discussed on our first session what logic models are not. And a logic model is not a fully developed plan for designing or managing a program of policy, nor is it an evaluation plan. So remember that a logic model can provide guidance about implementation, but further specification is needed in an implementation plan. So as Karen mentioned here, this is a very basic logic model in its simplest form. But logic models can pretty much look like anything. We showed you this during session 1 of the workshop. The point here is to capture the main ideas in the boxes, such as the problem statement and assumptions. And as you see here in the middle of the logic models, this is where you would list your resources, strategies, and activities, your outputs, short-term and long-term outcomes, as well as your impacts. In the back of your workbook are some examples of logic models, but I'm going to show you one of the logic models that we developed for one of our cases. So here we have a logic model that we actually created for the educator evaluation case. Now you can find a description of all of our case examples on page 7 of your workbook. Feel free to read over them quickly when you get a chance, since we will be referring to both the educator evaluation and college-ready cases throughout the webinar. I just want to take a couple of minutes with this logic model so that you can get a better idea on the different components of a logic model, especially the components that are important in thinking about evaluation. So here, as you can see, is an example, and of course there's a lot more examples in your workbook. You will see here the representation of all the categories, and the center of the logic model is where I want you to focus more on, because this is where you have your resources, your strategies and activities, your outputs, your short-term and long-term outcomes, as well as your impacts. And this is the part of the logic model that is important in thinking about evaluation, and these are sort of the parts of the logic model that are going to be our focus for today. So as you see here, just to kind of give you a really quick example, when you think about a short-term outcome here, they want the evaluation model utilized in 3 pilot schools, but eventually the final impact is, and the hoped for changes over the long haul, is that this new evaluation system will be used in all schools. So now if we can go back to the presentation. So hopefully this gives you sort of an idea of what a logic model looks like. Now, here are some questions to consider when developing your logic model. I would like to reiterate that a logic model is a representation of a process, and it's not the final product, but a visual representation of what a group of engaged stakeholders have determined to be of importance about their program of policy. And these questions that you have, these are questions that you would ask, a group in developing, a logic model, like, is the problem statement the right grain size, or is there a clear time frame for the outcomes, and what was the process in developing this logic model? Sometimes groups have taken these questions and they have developed a rubric based on these questions for their own logic model. So now I'm going to hand it over to Karen, who is going to be introducing evaluations.
Thank you, Shayla. So now that we've given you a little bit of background on logic models, and I know that many of you have indicated that you're familiar with logic models already, I just want to point out that the logic model template we have up in the left corner is really a very simple one, and that logic models vary in how they look. Some have elements that others don't, but this is just kind of a basic one to use as a resource as we walk through. So moving on to evaluation. So at a basic level, evaluation answers the questions, are we successful? Have we had an impact? And what exactly is making the difference? So what are the most influential aspects of our program? When we think more specifically about the types of questions that an evaluation asks, they are questions about the effectiveness of our program and policy, whether or not it's working as intended, is it being implemented as we had initially intended, and more specifically, what aspects of our program are working and what aspects may not be working or not working to the extent that we had anticipated. When we think about evaluation, the issue of timing is really important in building the evaluation. A high-quality evaluation is one that's designed to support your work and inform what you do as you're doing it, and therefore enhance your impact. In order to do that, evaluation really should be considered at the onset of program and policy design, which is ideally when the logic model is being developed. As a reminder, and Shayla referenced this as well, the logic model, we often, we have this product at the end of it, but it's really important to remember that the logic model process is one that is as critical as the resulting product. So when you think about building your logic model and you think about building your evaluation, you want to think about the process that you engage in and who's at the table, what people do you bring in to participate with you in defining the key questions for your evaluation. So just as your program and policy is conceived collectively with the right people at the table, similarly your evaluation of that program or policy should be part of the conversation with those same key people at the table. Now we'd like to ask you to do some thinking. This is our first opportunity to hear a little bit from you, to think about a program or policy of your own. And we have a wide range of people here. We have people from state departments of education, from districts, from nonprofits. Take one program or policy that you're working on that you might like to evaluate. And ask yourself the question, how will I know if I'm achieving the desired results? So for example, if you were to think about the College Ready program that is one of the cases in our workbook, perhaps college admissions increase, or the rate of college going for a particular high school goes up. And that would be a way I would know that the program I have, the College Ready program, is achieving its goals. So take a moment now. I can see that people are starting to write. And go ahead and just jot in shorthand what might be some of the ways that you would know that your program or policy is being successful, is reaching the goals that you have for it. And again, this is just to get your juices flowing and get you thinking about the kinds of things that you think about when you begin to build an evaluation. I can see that people are typing. I hope things will show up. If you have not looked in the workbook at the cases, we have two cases that we'll be referencing, as Shayla said. One is the College Ready program, and the other is a district-level educator evaluation. So I see that someone has put in summer school programs. So I'm wondering a little bit about that and thinking about that. If an indicator of success or a way that I would know that I am being successful is summer school program, of course, I wonder, well, what's the program there that is evidence of? So again, you want to think about what is the evidence that you have. How will you know that you're being successful? I see here one from Kristen Reedy, that the proficiency gap between students with disabilities and those with and all students will be reduced. So that's a very concrete evidence of a success of a program. Students in the program are being admitted to college at higher rates than non-participating students, so that must be a program about building college readiness. Here's one about implementation of a teacher effectiveness system, where how you would know you're being successful is students will be proficient as measured on state exams, so more students becoming proficient. So there is an interesting one that we think about a lot in terms of the links between educator effectiveness and outcomes for students, and that would be sort of a long-term piece of evidence that you're being successful. We've got several more here. I'll just point to a few more. District-developed professional development master plans will meet the regulatory requirements without further revision. So that must be a program that is working to build the capacity of local districts to develop master plans of professional development. Maybe it's training and additional support to districts, and evidence of success would be that they would, the master plans would meet the requirements. And finally, let's close with the students selecting STEM majors, having an increase in students selecting majors in the STEM areas. So that must be a program focusing on building interest in STEM and building capacity in STEM for post-secondary students, I think. So that's great. You guys are getting your juices flowing, thinking about the types of evidence that you would need to demonstrate the effectiveness of a program or policy. We'll move on now and move back to the presentation and dive into a little bit more introduction to evaluation. Generally, evaluations are designed to do one of two things or some combination, either to improve aspects of a program or to prove or show that a program is reaching its intended goals. For example, if you're thinking about an improved type of evaluation, and you want to take the case of educator evaluation, and someone referenced this just as we were putting things up on the chat pod, you might be thinking about the practices, you might be thinking about, as an improve goal, identifying the practices that achieve the goal of improving teachers' use of data to inform instruction. So you would be looking at what are the practices that really make the difference in terms of improving teachers' use of data. Whereas a prove goal for that same evaluation might be to prove that the evaluation system is achieving the goal of greater differentiation in teachers' ratings, or as our colleague from Kentucky mentioned in the chat pod, perhaps even achieving the goal of improving student achievement. So again, sort of a simple way to think about evaluations is improve and prove, or as I'm going to show, often these are the formative, improve are the formative types of evaluations, the process or implementation types of evaluations. And these focus on, if you're looking at the logic model template in your left-hand corner, these really focus in the logic model on the strategies and activities and outputs section of the logic model, whereas the prove or the evaluations that demonstrate outcomes or the results of the program are, again, these are thought of as the summative results or outcome-related evaluations, and really focus in that to the right side of that logic model on your short-term, long-term, and impact sections of your logic model. A little bit more about these types of evaluation and some of the language that you may hear as people are talking about evaluation. We've kind of got these two umbrellas of improve and prove evaluations. And again, I just want to clarify that these are not mutually exclusive. Oftentimes, we are conducting evaluations where we want to do both simultaneously. But again, here's some language that you hear when people talk about evaluation. In the improve category, there are needs assessments, and these are the types of evaluations that generally determine what would be needed at the onset of building a program and help to set the priorities. And these types of evaluations may even be conducted prior to the construction of a logic model and help to clarify what the problem is that would then sort of generate the logic model. Process or formative evaluations are the type of evaluations where one examines what goes on in the program while it's in progress. And the evaluations that are in the process or formative arena generally assess what the program is, how it's working, whom it's reaching, and how it's going about doing that. Under the prove umbrella, we have outcome and impact evaluations. Outcome evaluations, again, focusing in the logic model and the outcomes section of the logic model, generally look at what the results are for the program and its consequences, specifically for the people who are most directly affected by the program. So looking at the impact or looking at the outcomes of the program for participants. You know, did they increase their knowledge? Did they change their attitudes? Did their behavior change? And so forth. Impact evaluations are the type of evaluations that determine the net causal effects of the program beyond immediate results. So these are the types of evaluations that often will employ a comparison, looking at what appeared after the program with what would have appeared without the program. Evaluations that are impact evaluations generally have comparison groups, employ interrupted time series, or other types of methodologies or designs that allow the evaluator to capture what did happen to the target population compared to what would have happened without that program. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of some of the language around different types of evaluations. We'd like to do something here where you're going to see your first poll for today. And again, we're trying to use this format to really get you thinking and pull your ideas out. So we've got two questions here up on this poll that you'll see, and we're trying to help you think about the difference between these improve or formative types of evaluations and prove or summative types of evaluations. And you'll see the first poll is asking you, thinking about the College Ready program, what might be a formative type of evaluation question? And the second poll asks you, and you can select all that apply. There isn't one. There's more than one in each case. And the second poll asks you to think about an outcome type of evaluation for the teacher evaluation system. So take a moment. Several of you are jumping right in and responding, thinking about the types of questions you would ask if you were interested in improving or formative related aspects of evaluation versus the types of questions you might ask if you're interested in looking at the outcomes. So I'm just taking a look here. Oh, I'm sorry, something with my screen has just gone wrong. So I'm going to switch to my colleague's computer here and have a look at what's happening on his computer here. I can see that many of you are noticing that the College Ready program, engaging families in the college application process, would be that kind of formative question. So you'd be looking there at what might be happening along the way to engage families in the process, as well as parent participation holding steady. Great. Those are the types of formative questions that you would ask. And then we have a few people thinking about the College Ready program enrolling in post-secondary education as a formative type of question. We had imagined that as a outcome-related question because the goal, and again, you know, if you read the case, this might be more clear to you. The College Ready program is focused on secondary students, and so that enrollment is sort of an outcome or a goal of the program. Looking over at the teacher evaluation, we have which of the following questions would be asked to understand outcomes of the teacher evaluation system. We know several of you out there are thinking really critically about that. And what are outcomes associated with the teacher evaluation system? Many of you have noted the bottom one, student achievement improving as a result of the new teacher evaluation system. Also important to think about more intermediate outcomes of the teacher evaluation system, and I see many of you have selected the differentiation among teachers as an outcome. Interestingly, you've also chosen principals completing all the requirements of the evaluation as an outcome. I would see that as quite a short-term outcome for an evaluation, but certainly one that if you're doing a lot of training of principals and evaluators, that seeing that change is one that would be a critical short-term outcome of the program. So with that, let's turn back to the slides and move along. We're just moving back to the slides here. And I have a little pause as we're doing that. And here they come. And we're going to turn it over to Shayla now, who's going to talk us through, there you go, Shayla, talk us through the questions.
Yes, so here, as you answered in the previous poll, where Karen was talking about formative questions, you know, a lot of you answered that a formative question for the College Ready cases, holding steady, is participation holding steady for the monthly workshops, or you know, or is it engaging families in the college application process? And then a summative one would be, you know, student achievement improving based on the results of the evaluation system. So talking about these improve related evaluation takes us right into the discussion of evaluation questions that fall into two categories, these formative and summative questions. So first, you want to consider what is the purpose of your evaluation. So if the purpose is on improvements to the program or policy, then one would need to develop formative questions. But if you are looking more on the impacts, and then summative questions will need to be developed and will be more appropriate. So for example, for formative questions, they are asked while the program is operating and can be asked if you are looking for improvements during the middle of the program. So this is where like your strategies, activities, and outputs would be in the logic model. And summative questions are asked at the completion or when the program ends. And these types of questions will give you answers on results and will help you determine if the program was effective or not. So again, here in the logic model, this would be where your outcomes would fall on the logic model. Now, regardless of the types of questions, there are some guidelines that you need to consider for all evaluation questions. And these are some guidelines that you need to ask yourself these 4 questions. So can the question be answered given the program? So one of the main reasons for building a logic model as part of the program evaluation is to determine what questions are appropriate based on the program. And by describing what the program is, the logic model helps determine what is appropriate to evaluate. Another question is, are the questions high priority? You know, you want to try to distinguish between what you need to know and what may merely be nice to know. Are the questions, you know, practical and appropriate to the capacity you have to answer them? So you need to consider time, your resources, and the availability of assistance needed to answer the questions. And last but not least, this is really important. Are the questions clear and jargon-free? So you want to avoid the use of jargon or vague words that can have multiple meanings. You want to always define the key terms so that everyone understands the meaning. So here, again, we're going to do another activity that you're going to be entering in the chat pod. And we're going to be doing an activity that you're going to be developing your own formative or summative evaluation question. So I want you to think about your own program of policy and what may be a good formative question or what may be a good summative evaluation question. So as you can see on top of the poll, there's a couple of examples. And here, an example of a formative question, and this is from the College Ready case, is parent participation holding steady for the monthly workshops. An example in thinking about the College Ready case of a summative question would be, students who are participating in the program, are they maintaining a 3.0 or above GPA in post-secondary education? So let's take a moment to see what folks have come up with. Please enter in the chat pod. So think about, your own program of policy, because we want to try to make this as relevant as possible, and what a formative question would be. And again, this is thinking about your strategies and activities and outputs. And then also thinking about summative questions, so thinking about what would be your results or outcomes. So here we have Ann Rothstein who's saying, are the grades for students in the College Now program consistent? Yeah, that's a great formative question. You definitely want to make sure that students are being consistent and learning in the process. Another one from Bart Ligori here, are teachers in the pilot teacher effectiveness system implementing the system with fidelity? Yeah, fidelity is definitely key here. That's a great formative question. Does anybody have any good summative questions? When thinking about your program of policy, what are some of the outcomes that you would like to see? Here, formative questions, another one from Jeannie. Which districts are attending the capacity building events, and are they the districts whose plans are up for renewal? Phyllis has a question here, a formative question. Are IEPs being written so they are functional and usable in a variety of environments? That's a good one in thinking about IEPs. It's a great formative type of evaluation question. So now let's try to focus on some summative questions. Now that you've kind of gotten the idea of what a formative evaluation question would be, these are really great. So Ed Goddard here says, is there a reduction in remedial courses required in post-secondary education? Yeah, and thinking about what happens in post-secondary. Are they going to have to, the College Ready course hopefully will reduce the amount of time that they would have to take remedial courses or not taking remedial courses at all. Maureen here from Worcester Public Schools, did our college access program increase student post-secondary enrollment? Again, that would be a key thing, a key outcome for secondary school students is increasing enrollment in post-secondary education. Let me do another one by Heidi. Have there been improvements in teacher effectiveness regarding diverse learners? So maybe looking at those types of students and looking at student achievement in that way. Are they being effective? Are they differentiating their instruction? Is that in turn affecting student achievement? These are really great examples. So now we can go back to our presentation. And here, this is a critical aspect of developing appropriate and important questions for an evaluation, is to consider who might want to know what about your program of policy. So here, I just want to kind of point out that thinking about your audience is definitely a critical piece in developing these questions. So you need to ask yourself, who wants to know? Consider, questions, your audience may have. And then think about how the results are going to be used. Is it going to be used for further funding opportunities or to make changes to the program of policy? We're not going to be doing an activity on this, but I want you to think about one question you may have when thinking about your audience. So, are your audience going to be participants, funders, staff? And in thinking about that, you need to think about what kind of questions are they going to have? What are they going to want to know? And how are the results going to be used for this? And this is, I just wanted to kind of point out. In the next slide, we're going to kind of dive in, and I wanted to give you a couple of examples on what this may look like. So here we have in this chart an example of some types of audiences you may have, and the types of questions that they may have about a certain program or policy, and how they may apply those answers to make decisions that are going to affect the program. So let's take the College Ready case here. So let's say that your audience is the program staff, and they're going to be interested in making sure that they reach out to the students who are most in need and will benefit most from the College Ready program. So they're going to be asking, is the program reaching out to low-income or first-generation college students? Another good example is if your audience is the funder. And let's say, for the College Ready program, the funder is the Gates Foundation. They're going to ask questions that are going to determine if funding the program is a good use of their money. They're going to want to know, what are your goals? Are you meeting those goals? And are the costs worth it? So hopefully this gives you a good idea in thinking about your audience and sort of the types of questions that they would have in order to answer any evaluation questions. So now I'm going to turn it over to Karen.
Thank you. We thought we would pause here and let you take a moment to enter in the chat any questions that might have emerged for you thus far, thinking about evaluation questions and formative and summative, thinking of those two categories. There was one that came up. Someone asked about what the difference was between a theory of action and a logic model, and I'll just quickly point out that generally what we would say is that a logic model is a visual representation of a theory of action. If you're interested in sort of learning a bit more about the different ways that we think about logic models and how we use logic models, I certainly encourage you to go to the archive of our first session and look at the workbook there. We talk about different types of logic models and how they function. But in general, a logic model is really a visual representation, a simplified picture of a theory of action driving a program or policy. But I'm just pausing here to see if folks have any other questions thinking about formative and summative questions and formative and summative evaluation. From here, we're going to get into indicators and thinking about how you use the logic model as a tool for generating indicators, and again, sort of going back and thinking about logic model in terms of indicators and evaluation questions. So I'm just pausing for a moment to see if anyone wants to enter anything in chat. I do see that there's one question coming in. And again, this is not your only opportunity to ask questions. We will try to capture all of the questions that people pose as we work through the session. And any chat questions that come up, we'll try to take note of and try to answer at some point. I don't see anyone entering. I thought someone was entering, but it doesn't look like anyone is entering questions. So again, let me just remind you that at any time you can go to the chat and enter your questions in chat. And also remind you that if you haven't downloaded the workbook yet, that again you can find the workbook, which is a supplement to this workshop today, under the Download Today's Files section of the Adobe screen that you're looking at. So with that, I am going to move on. And again, we will try to address any questions that come up as we move along. So let me take you to indicators. And you'll see here a picture of a little girl. And what we would like you to do is to consider this picture. Because as we move from evaluation questions to indicators, we start to think about evidence. So I want you to take a look at this little girl and think about how we would know if she or any child has the flu. What would be the indicators or the evidence that we would use to assess whether or not someone has the flu? And we invite you to this is sort of a playful exercise again, but just get you thinking about what is the evidence that we would employ? How would we make the determination that this little girl has the flu? And I can see the question, does the child have a headache? How would we know that? What might be some of the evidence that we would employ to know if she has a headache? I see the presence of a temperature. Does she have a fever? Does she have chills? What might be some other indicators that we might look at to know whether or not this child has the flu? Is she hot? Would we feel her forehead? Level of physical activity, is she lethargic? The reading from the thermometer, what is the number on the thermometer? what symptoms of the flu? Yes, so the question is, what would those symptoms be? What would be the evidence of the flu? A positive nasal swab for influenza, that would be a very useful tool. I know that when I'm at home at midnight with my kid, I don't have that, but I could get that. Again, temperature from the thermometer. Is she complaining? Is there evidence from her that her head hurts? Is she vomiting? We go to a trained technician to tell us whether or not she has the flu. We think about her exposure. Has she been exposed to others? Does she have a runny nose? So again, you think about the wide range of tools that we use at our disposal from our own observations to make the assessment that our child has the flu. And again, there are a wide range of potential pieces of evidence that we might employ to assess whether or not our child has the flu. So now we can go back to the slides and move us from the sort of fun activity of thinking about this cute little girl and whether or not she has the flu to thinking about indicators in the way that we use them in conducting an evaluation. Because as we begin to develop our evaluation questions, we need to consider how we will know that we've achieved the goals. And by identifying how we will know, which are those pieces of evidence like we just did with that exercise, we begin to identify the specific evidence that we need to answer our evaluation questions of interest. So basically, if we're asking, is our program successful, we need to have some understanding of how we'll measure success. In other words, we need to answer the question, how will we know specifically that we are successful? So we've taken this example from the child with the flu, but let's take an example from the teacher evaluation system. And we want to know whether our new teacher evaluation system is achieving the goal of increasing teachers' use of student data to make decisions about practice. Because as many of us know, there are many goals for these educator evaluation systems, and one of those goals has to do with teacher practice. So we want to know how we would achieve the goal of teachers employing student data to make decisions. But we have to think about how we will know if teachers are actually doing it. What would it look like? What would the evidence be, and how would we know that teachers are employing student data to make decisions about practice? So a few things to think about are what makes indicators different, essentially, from what we have in the logic model. How do we move beyond the logic model into indicators? So using the logic model's outputs and outcomes, they serve as sort of the launch for generating your indicators. But the outputs and outcomes in your logic model are not the indicators. The indicators are more specific than the outcomes that you see in the logic model. The outcomes are your general goals for program implementation, but indicators are specific and measurable targets. They can be seen, heard, read, or felt. They're the tangible evidence of the phenomena that is represented in the outcome. So again, if you use that example of teacher evaluation and changes in teachers' practice, the outcome might be to have teachers employ data more effectively to make decisions about teacher practice. But the indicator would be something more specific and tangible. It would be the temperature reading or the feeling the forehead as the evidence that we actually have of that phenomena. Indicators are connected to the strategies and activities, the outputs and the outcomes of your logic model. They're derived from that section of the logic model, and we'll walk you through that. But really the thing to remember is that the indicators are the evidence, the tangible evidence that represent the phenomenon of interest that is the outcome or the impact that we see in our logic model. So let's walk you through that a little bit, thinking about this. So let's look at how we can use the logic model as our starting point from which to build these tangible, these measurable indicators of the success of our program or policy. So just as the logic model moves from inputs or resources, so if you see the small logic model template, you've got to your left the resources. Those are the inputs. That's what you put into the program. To outputs, so that's what you do with your resources. You have a set of strategies and activities associated with your program. To outcomes, and that's what you hope to achieve or the results of your program. So just as that's sort of the flow of the logic models, we can follow the same logic to develop indicators at different stages of the logic model. So if you think about making this really clear, if you think about input-related indicators, those would measure the amount of resources that you use. Output-related indicators would, and again, output, when we refer to output here, we're thinking about the section of the logic model that focuses on the strategies and activities and any outputs that we state in the logic model that are specifically related to those strategies. So an output-related indicator would look at the number or percentage of strategies implemented. They're really that sort of fidelity of implementation. Are we doing what we said we were going to do in our activities and strategies section? And the outcome-related indicators would be the ones that take a tangible measure of the results or the outcome of the program. The number of, the percent who learn the material or the number who learn the material, the level of overall improvement, the outcomes for students, and so forth. Let's take an example from the College Ready case to just illustrate how we move from the logic model to the indicators. So if you have an activity for your College Ready, and again, the College Ready logic model case is at the back of your workbook if you want to refer to that specific sample logic model. But if you have an activity within a larger strategy of parent engagement, and that activity is to deliver a set of parent education classes, then a related indicator of success for that activity might be the specific number of classes that were delivered or the number of parents who attended those classes. Those would be indicators related to the strategy and activity section of that logic model. Whereas if you have an outcome in that logic model of increasing parental understanding of the college application process, then you would want a tangible, measurable way of observing an increase in parent understanding. So when you move from that outcome to the indicator, it's perhaps the number of parents reporting increased understanding on a parent survey, or in a focus group with parents at the end of the sessions, they might articulate an increased understanding. And these would serve as indicators related to that desired outcome of increasing parent understanding. So just a few things to think about when you think about generating indicators. Some questions to ask yourself. When generating these indicators, you want to ask yourself some basic questions. How would you know with the evidence you can collect that your goal has been reached? What would be our benchmarks or parameters for success? Thinking back again to the girl with the flu, you were perhaps looking not just for the presence of any temperature. 98.5 might not cut it. You might expect the girl to, say, have a temperature of over 101 to qualify for as a real fever, as the flu. So similarly, when you think about benchmarks or parameters for your indicators, you want to think about the specific indicators, what they would be, and be reasonable in generating them. Think again about how you would know that teachers were using data. Would having data on their desk at a meeting be enough of an indicator, or would you want to see them referencing that data in their meetings with their evaluators? Again, you want to be specific. The indicator is when you get specific about what would be your benchmarks of success. Now finally, think about your program or policy. If you were to walk in on it in action, what would you see? What would you hear? What might you read? If you walked in on a teacher evaluation meeting between a teacher and a supervisor, what would you expect to see, hear, or read that would be an indicator to you that your program is being successful? I know there are some questions that are coming in, and I hope that we'll have the chance to address them as we move along. I think I might just pause here for a minute because we didn't pause before. I know there was a question that came in about logic models. Some consultants have claimed that logic models are useless because they're linear. This argument can be used to justify not using logic models. How do we combat this? Well, I would certainly argue that logic models are not intended to be linear, but to represent relationships. And in our previous workshop that you can refer to, we talk at some length about the iterative nature of logic models and ways that you can use arrows and relationships between the different pieces of the logic model to demonstrate the way that a program or policy could be iterative in nature, that an outcome, a short-term outcome may lead to a new strategy and activity and so forth. So there are limitations in terms of our own capacity to think non-linearly, but certainly logic models do not have to be linear. However, I will say that in the work that we're doing today and what we're showing you today, we assume a kind of linearity because we're kind of talking about moving from logic models and beyond them into generating indicators of success and evaluation questions. So I hope that is some answer, and I believe that some of you are also responding to your own questions. So with that, I will continue on and invite you to keep asking questions as you move along. And you'll notice a very linear picture here. But again, here we're trying to illustrate that the logic model really marks a path from an activity or an overarching strategy to an output of that strategy to an outcome that you hope. And then from there, that's sort of where the logic model ends. And that's where, when you're generating an evaluation, you pick up and start to think about indicators related to those outcomes of interest. So again, you think about those first three categories being in the logic model, and then your task is to generate those indicators out of that. So we've given you an example here to illustrate this. With the College Ready program as the example, we've got this overarching strategy of parent education. And within that parent education strategy, we have an activity of a parent workshop series on college readiness. So the output for that activity is a set of workshops, 6 of them, that were developed and delivered with a target number of 100 parents recruited to participate. So again, that all might still be in the logic model. And then the outcome identified for this particular strategy of parent education is increased parental understanding of the college application process. So that's where the logic model ends. And now how do we develop an indicator from that path, from the activity to the output to the outcome? How do we develop an indicator to show or to demonstrate success of that outcome? Indicators can generally fall into these 2 categories. And again, this is sort of a theme throughout, is this idea of formative and summative, improve, prove, or process and outcome is the language we have here. So a process indicator is generally one that has to do with the extent to which the strategies or activities are being implemented as intended. So here our process indicator is 70% of parents attend at least 5 of the 6 workshops. So that's our process indicator. That's sort of our implementation process indicator. An outcome indicator is one that has to do with the extent to which the set of strategies and activities are yielding the desired results or the outcomes of the program. And here we've given the example that 80% of students in the program complete at least 1 college application by deadline. So that might be a fairly short-term outcome indicator, but again, it's an outcome indicator that we believe is related to increasing parental understanding. So if we've increased parental understanding in the college application process, our hope is that that might yield an increase in the number of students submitting their college applications on time. So that is just an example to illustrate sort of the logic of thinking from the logic model through to process and outcome indicators. And now I've done a lot of talking. We'd like you to take a moment to think about this. We've got an example here from the educator evaluation case where we've taken the activity of an evaluation training for evaluators. So we have to develop and implement an evaluation training for evaluators. Our output for that is that we develop and deliver 2 summer and 2 fall workshops for our evaluators, and that our outcome associated with that is that the workshop or that the evaluation is then piloted with a set of evaluators in 2 elementary schools and 1 high school. So that's our outcome for that, is that from these trainings comes the implementation. Now, we'd like you to do some thinking about what might be a process indicator and an outcome indicator related to that sort of that logic, from that activity of developing and implementing evaluation training for evaluators to the outcome of the pilot of the new evaluation system in a set of schools. What might be a process indicator? What might be something to indicate that it's being implemented as intended? And what might be an outcome indicator? And again, you want to think a little creatively here because this is a fairly narrow example where we don't have the outcome being, say, an improvement in student achievement. So what might be an outcome associated, an outcome-related indicator associated with this example? So I see that Anne Rothstein has put that 80% of evaluators as a process indicator, 80% of evaluators indicated a high understanding of the evaluation instrument. Yeah, so you might use a tool like an end-of-workshop survey to assess the degree to which the evaluation instrument is accessible and understood by your participants. We have all teachers receive training from the workshops. That's right. So if you're doing an evaluator training that short-term or a process indicator or a formative indicator might be something about the participation in the workshops. Other people are writing. We have how many workshops have draft materials completed on time. So some process indicator might have to do with the materials, that the materials are completed on time, or that the materials might be aligned to the state rubric. That might be something. Edward might say a little more about inter-rater reliability. That's something that maybe there are trainings on. Maybe there's a high understanding of inter-rater reliability between evaluators as a result of participating in the workshops. What is the degree of participant satisfaction with workshops? I would invite the people who are framing these as questions to think that these wouldn't be questions. You want to think about these as your evidence, your indicators of success. If there are ways to quantify or to capture an outcome, the success of an outcome with an indicator here, try not to frame it as a question. Try to frame it in terms of what would be your indicator of success. Again, remember at the very beginning we asked you, how will you know? How will you know that that your program is achieving its goals? So the question here is really, how will you know that the evaluation training for evaluators was successful in terms of the process, in terms of it being implemented as intended, and then in terms of outcomes, how will you know it's achieving the results that you hope that it will achieve? So let's see. If there's a test at the end of the workshop, perhaps 80% of evaluators score above 90% on post-test. So maybe if you conduct some sort of pre- and post-assessment of your evaluators about their overall understanding of the measures in the evaluation system, you identify an increase in the understanding. High levels of satisfaction with the workshops, all of those things could be process indicators. Let's see what people have in terms of outcome indicators. All teachers within the pilot schools are evaluated using the new system. Yes, so let's say that you've got these 3 pilot schools and you've done all this training. You want to see that the pilot actually goes off as planned, and that would actually be an outcome for the pilot, would be that the evaluation would be conducted on all the teachers who are supposed to be evaluated in that year. And Donna has, if there's a test at the end of the workshop, okay, we've got that again. So it could be that an outcome indicator, again, this is not a perfect science. So sometimes process indicators could also be outcome indicators, and we're seeing that Donna is seeing that in that matching. And with that, we've got another one here. Majority of participants rate the workshops with high level of satisfaction in terms of the relevance, usefulness, and quality. So that's interesting. So that could be an outcome or a process indicator. It depends on how you think about it and what your outcome is for this in this particular example. I'm going to stop there and just invite you to take a look at page 20 of your workshop at a later date, and we'll go back to the presentation. But you'll see this activity on 20. And when you think about your own program or policy, we think that going through this activity with your key outcomes of interest and thinking about both process and outcome indicators associated with your key outcomes of interest can be a very useful strategy for you in terms of generating the most important indicators. Another thing I just want to remind you about, because we like to remind people about this on a regular basis, is that you don't want to do this in your office in front of your computer by yourself. This would be a great activity to engage in with others who would be stakeholders in an evaluation. Who would be an important person to have at the table when you're thinking about this? You might have other staff members. You might have some participants. If it's a program that works with students, you might have kids and parents. Again, thinking about what are the ways that you can engage people in conversations about what are measures of success and how will we know. And that's really what all of these activities are designed to do, is to get you thinking critically about that. So to move along, we have here, again, moving back and forth, and this workshop is really about kind of moving back and forth from your logic model to building your evaluation. We want to consider how we move from the logic model to the evaluation questions through those indicators. So if we would derive our indicators from our logic model, we can also derive our evaluation questions from the logic model. And different indicators are relevant to different types of questions. So if we look at the indicators related to resources, so the amount of resources that we employ, then questions related to those indicators would be about the extent to which the resources we had were sufficient. So if you think about that college-ready example, we might want to know whether the funding provided was sufficient to staff the program with the right people and enough of them and enough of their time. So indicators related to the resources would really be about whether or not the resources are sufficient to run the program as intended. When we think about outputs and we move from the outputs to the indicators, these really have to do with understanding whether or not the program was implemented as intended. And and indicators associated with outputs really try to get at the degree to which the program's sort of went off as we'd hoped it would? Did we have the number of workshops intended? Was our participation what we'd hoped, and so forth? And therefore, questions associated, evaluation questions associated with the outputs, which are the strategies, activities, and outputs section of the logic model, would really be about the degree to which implementation occurred as desired, and whether or not attendance was appropriate. Did we reach the people we intended to reach? So using the College Ready case, an evaluation question related to the output section might consider whether the workshops addressed the most relevant content or whether participation remained steady throughout the workshops. Did we lose parents in our parent workshop series as we went through? And really get at why that might be and sort of what's behind whether or not the program whether or not the program kind of did what we intended to have it do in terms of the activities that we designed. Finally, thinking about the logic model and the outcomes and impact section of the logic model, the types of outcome-related indicators we have to do with overall improvement, changes in knowledge and behavior, and so forth. And so evaluation questions associated with that logic from the outcome to indicators to evaluation questions would have to do with whether or not the program saw a change in participants' knowledge or understanding or skill, behavior, and so forth. So with the College Ready example, again, we might ask, did parents' understanding of the college application process improve? Did students ultimately go to college, and so forth? So again, there can be both short-term and long-term types of outcome-related evaluation questions, but they have to do with the results of the program. Sometimes, and getting more into thinking about the right indicators for any given outcome, sometimes one indicator may be sufficient to capture an outcome of interest. So some indicators may be straightforward and easier to measure than others. So for example, if you take the outcome of reducing dropouts, which may be sort of an outcome of a College Ready program, reducing dropout reduction. In that example, it may be that a single indicator is sufficient to measure the success of that outcome. It may be that one agreed-upon indicator, such as the graduation rate, is sufficient to understand that you're achieving the goal of reducing dropouts. However, in other cases, you may need more than one indicator to understand a more complex outcome. So if you take the example here of parental involvement in school, that's a more complex outcome to capture via indicators than, say, dropouts, which we do have this sort of this one standard and agreed upon outcome or indicator of graduation rates. So we'd like to pause here and go to a chat pod and ask you to think about parental involvement and what might be many of the ways that you might think about indicators or evidence that you know you're being successful in terms of increasing parental engagement or parental involvement. So think about that and just take a moment to type in what might be some of the ways that you would know that you're being successful in engaging parents. You know, we have some examples that we can pull on, so perhaps attendance at school meetings might be evidence, and here we have Ann Rothstein commenting on parent participation in open school nights. So oftentimes, certainly, there are these events, and what's parent engagement like at these events? That would be one piece of evidence. Surveys, perhaps we survey parents and find out the extent to which they are engaged in school. We can ask them all kinds of questions about their understanding of what's happening in school or events that they attend. Perhaps we chart the number of calls that parents are making to the school, and if we are trying to increase parent engagement and we see an increase in the number of calls to the school. There we have Anna Griffin with Reading My Mind, communications received from parents. Are parents reaching out to the school? To what extent are parents participating in parent-teacher organization? Do we see increased numbers of parents on the attendance logs at these parent events? Are we seeing, that's an interesting one Sarah Davila has, are we seeing participation among parents who previously did not participate? Do we have cohorts of parents or subgroups of parents that we're specifically interested in reaching out to? And are we seeing an increase in the extent to which those parents are coming to open school nights, participating in the PTO, in the number of hours that parents spend in school, in volunteering in school or in the school in general? Do we administer a survey to principals and teachers about parent engagement and find out about the degree of parent engagement via that? So again, you all are sort of, the juices are flowing about the kinds of ways and the range of ways that we might capture parent involvement. And again, that's the idea here, is we really, when you're thinking about indicators of success, when you're moving from your outcomes, and many of you in logic models will have outcomes that are quite complex, and so generating a wide range, being expansive at this point, of potential indicators of success is helpful for you, because then you have to whittle it down to what kind of data you can actually gather. But you start more expansively, and then you move to a core set of indicators that you can work with and you can gather data about. So we'll move back to the presentation, and I've gone through some of the examples that talked about, and you all touched on all of them. So you'll just see that, again, the idea is to be expansive initially and then move from more expansive to what are tangible data sources that you have. And with that, we're going to move into getting more specific. So indicators may be quantitative or they may be qualitative. Quantitative data may be best suited to summative evaluations. In other words, information related to proving or showing the value or impact of your program or policy. Whereas qualitative data may be better suited to formative evaluations, or those that focus on how to improve the program. What are the aspects of the program that are working and what aren't, and learning more about why. However, I want to hasten to say that it's not to suggest that all formative evaluations are qualitative and all summative evaluations are quantitative. That's absolutely not the case. It's often a mix of measures that's the best approach. The qualitative data that we collect via interviews or observations or other qualitative methodologies, these often provide the depth of information that we need to help interpret the quantitative data that we collect, such as test scores or graduation rates. And again, that gets back to this idea of formative and summative, improve and prove. You know, we want to both know that we're achieving the results that we hope to achieve, and we want to know that a wide range of ways, and then we also want to know why. And it's often that qualitative data that helps us to understand why. And so we certainly encourage you to consider a mix of measures when you're generating the measures that you will use ultimately in your evaluation. So you'll see in your workbook, and Shayla has pointed out to you that it's on page 21 of the workbook, you'll see a template for working through this on your own. But we've given an example here of the College Ready case. And we have a question here, and we ask you to think about the types of quantitative and qualitative indicators related to the College Ready case. So we have the question about whether or not the program increased students' interest in college. And you see here that the quantitative indicator would be the number of college applications that were completed, whereas the qualitative indicator might be interviews with the guidance counselors and their reports of an increase in student interest in college. So again, we might have more than one data source to answer the same question, one quantitative and one qualitative. Now we take the example from the educator evaluation case, and we ask a question about whether or not the new evaluation system contributes to improvements in teacher accountability for student performance. And you'll note here, and you may note this as we're going through, the types of evaluation questions that we've posed related to the educator evaluation case. We're trying to think about a wide range of outcomes associated with the new educator evaluation, many of them being the types of outcomes that you might see more in the short or intermediate term related to the educator evaluation system, rather than only focusing on that long-term outcome of changes in student achievement, because we really do think there are a wide range of outcomes that you might consider and a wide range of evaluation questions you might ask about new educator evaluation systems. So here we have, and we are going to do something a little different here. We're taking you to a poll, and we are asking you, there's not one right answer, but we're going to ask you to think about what indicators, and the indicators we put here are both quantitative and qualitative. Which ones would you choose if you could choose only 3 indicators to measure whether or not your new evaluation system is improving teachers' accountability for student performance? So we've given you 5 examples of potential indicators. We didn't have an option for an other here, but there certainly are other potential indicators you might consider. But just to have you think about, well, if I were doing this, and some of you are doing this work, which would be the indicators that you would select to measure the success of your program in terms of increasing teacher accountability for student outcomes? So I can see that many of you are choosing a percent of teachers reporting in a survey that they feel increased accountability. So that's teacher self-reporting on feeling higher accountability. Many of you are choosing these interviewers with the evaluators. So evaluators are direct contact with teachers. And what do evaluators say in terms of teachers increasing responsibility for student outcomes? We have student performance on standardized assessment improved. So that's another indicator. That would be probably a more long-term indicator, but certainly that's the objective down the road, is that if teachers are taking more accountability for student performance, that student performance on standardized assessments would improve. Few of you are noting the establishment of data teams in schools. I'm going to venture a guess that many schools already have data teams, and so that wouldn't be strong evidence of a change in teachers' beliefs or behaviors. And some of you are choosing student learning objectives. For many of the states that we work with in the REL, student learning objectives, or SLOs, are a key part of the new evaluation system. And so for those people who are using systems of evaluation that include SLOs, those might be a type of data that's already collected that you could employ to answer your question about whether or not you're seeing increased accountability. You might need to do some additional analyses of those SLOs to understand that. So that's great. So many of you have voted. So this was just kind of an exercise to have you thinking about if you have to make choices about the best indicators to answer a particular question, how do you make those choices? And people are still voting, but I think we'll move back to the presentation and a few appeal to different audiences. And this is something that Shayla talked about. Just as different evaluation questions may appeal to different audiences, your program staff may be interested in something quite different from your funder in terms of the types of indicators they want to see as evidence of success. So you want to think about who your audience is for a particular evaluation and what might really strike a chord in terms of the evidence that they would like to see in response to the questions of interest. So those are just some reminders to you as you think about generating your indicators. So with that, I just see a question before I move back to Shayla, and we'll move to the next section of the workshop. David Schwartz has asked, how would you suggest reflecting the strength of outcome data coming in? It seems like evidence-based practice principles need to be embedded at the logic model development stage. So I think the question here is about thinking about how there's a wide range of outcome data that you have available to you. Certainly people in states and in schools are employing a wide range of outcome data, but not all that outcome data is equal. And so thinking about a little bit of building the sophistication of people who are looking at evaluation, building, so if you're working with a group of teachers and principals, or if you're working with a group of practitioners and thinking about outcome data, you want to do a little training for them about understanding the range of outcome data as a part of thinking about building an evaluation. So certainly, if you're going to be identifying your indicators and thinking about the outcome data you have available, the folks who are doing that thinking have to have some knowledge of the data and the quality of different data that you have available to you. Let me answer Donna's question, and then I'll turn it back over to Shayla. If you're not meeting targets along the way, you would need some flexibility to add activities or subtract activities. Yes, so that, Donna, goes back to a lot of what we talked about in the logic model workshop, which we strongly encourage you to go back and take a look at those materials if you haven't already. That the logic model is not a static thing, it's a fluid thing. And similarly, so if you have this logic model and you're making changes, you're sort of revisiting your logic model on a regular basis, you'd also be revisiting your evaluation on a regular basis. Anyone who conducts evaluations knows that things don't ever go as planned. And so, you get data, but you get it later than you thought. Your program doesn't start when you thought it would start, and so whereas you thought you might see outcomes of interest by June of 2015, you're not really going to see them until the following year. So you certainly have to have some flexibility built in along the way, both in terms of revisiting your logic model and making changes as appropriate to your program and your program logic model. Similarly, there needs to be some flexibility in thinking about your evaluation design because of the realities that we all face when it comes to implementing a program and collecting the data that we hope to get. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Shayla, who's going to start to talk to us about building an evaluation design.
Thank you, Karen. So now we're going to talk a little bit about building an evaluation design. So now that you have a good, solid logic model and have developed good evaluation questions, now that you've considered the best indicators, then you will be ready to develop an evaluation design. And these are the things that you would need to consider in designing your evaluation. So you need to consider what is your purpose, who is your audience, what is your capacity, and what are your priorities. So in thinking about the purpose, you want to figure out if it's formative, which is based on improvements, or is it more summative where you focus on the overall impact of your program and policy, or is it a combination of both, or what we would call a hybrid model? Again, as I stated before, thinking about your audience and how are they going to use the information that you provide. Also, capacity is huge. Thinking about who is going to conduct the actual evaluation. What resources do you have available, or what will you need in order to complete the evaluation? Last but not least is priority. What do you need to know? So thinking about your financial or capacity limitations when it comes to this. Now that you've considered your purpose, your audience, capacity, and priorities, it's time to start thinking about your sources of data. And data collection is just as important, and you need to start thinking about your data collection needs and your capacity. So these are some questions to ask yourself, thinking about what you currently have readily available, any pre-existing data that you have access to. For example, in using the College Ready case, if you need to know the level of student engagement, then accessing and having access to student attendance records may be a good gauge for this. Or if the school is already using a student engagement survey, then maybe you can use that instrument as part of your evaluation design. So these are some of the things that you would need to start thinking about when designing your evaluation. Now here we have some potential data sources on this list of the types of data. As you can see here, we have administrative data, which would include attendance data. There are both quantitative and qualitative data sources here, but there may be other data sources that are not captured here that may be helpful in designing your evaluation. So we do encourage you and invite you to be as expansive as you can when thinking about your data. This list is actually on page 27 of your workbook, and there's also an activity that you can do on your own to brainstorm some ideas on possible data sources. So this is just kind of a list to kind of get you thinking about, okay, what sort of data sources do I need? What do I have access to? And if I don't have access to it, is there a way that I can get access to that data in order to design my evaluation? Now I'm going to hand it over to Karen, who's going to be going over the data collection framework. Karen?
Thanks, Shayla. So we have some tools here that we invite you to use on your own when you get to that stage in building your evaluation design. And again, these are really, the tools that you'll see in the next few slides are really designed to help you be systematic and strategic about preparing for an evaluation. So in addition to what Shayla talked about identifying potential data sources, there are a lot of details of data collection that must be ironed out early in planning for an evaluation. It's important to develop a clear sense of what types of data are available, who collects and manages the data, and when it's collected. So developing this kind of data collection framework linked to the activities and outcomes of your logic model will help to guide your evaluation process. And here we've just provided a tool, and it's in your workbook. And we're going to walk you through a couple examples here just to illustrate it. So the first example we have here is, so you take the College Ready case. And if you remember, we talked about the parent education strategy being an overarching strategy of the College Ready case. And an output or outcome of interest related to the parent education strategy is a high rate of parent attendance at those workshops. So the activity is a series of workshops, and an outcome of interest would be high attendance. This would be, and we talked quite a bit earlier about formative and summative types of indicators, this would be a formative related objective would be the high attendance at the workshops. Specifically the indicator, so we're moving sort of out of the logic model now and into the indicator and then into the data sources. The indicator would be 70% of parents attend 5 out of the 6 workshops. So that's just an example here of what our target would be, our measure of success. Now, what is the data source? Where does that come from? So we come up with that indicator. Do we know we have that data? So what would the data source be? Well, administrative data. What is the specific instrument? And attendance log at workshops. Now, here's where it gets kind of interesting. So you need to have someone collecting that information in order to actually know whether or not you're meeting that indicator of success. And that may seem obvious, but if you're building your evaluation design from the very beginning, you can build in both the will among your participants to collect the data that you need and also know that you are collecting the data to meet the outcomes of interest. So again, this goes back to that very beginning idea about how you want to be building your evaluation as you're building your program. Then you know that you will collect the data related to the outcomes of interest and the indicators that you have. So the data collection instrument, again, would be this attendance log. And then here's some specific stuff. Well, when is it collected? At the beginning of each session, and by whom? The program director. So you just want to lay this stuff out for yourself as you're thinking about your evaluation design, so you have a really good sense of where that data is coming from and how you would get it and when you would get it, because timing is always a critical piece of evaluation. And we've given you another example here, thinking about a summative type of outcome. So again, we have the parent education strategy. Well, we have this outcome we mentioned before of increasing parental understanding in the college application process, which would be a sort of a summative goal. The indicator that we have is 85% of parents who attend more than 4 workshops report increased understanding. Again, that depends on a couple indicators. We need to know that we need to have that attendance log to know who the parents are who attended more than 4 workshops. What would be the data source generally? It would be parent feedback. How would we collect that data? What's the instrument? Well, we could have a survey of parents at the end of the workshops. We could have interviews with parents who can articulate their increased understanding. When might we collect that? Well, maybe it would be a pre and post survey, so we would have beginning and end of program interviews or surveys with with parents. And then who would collect that? Well, we'd be depending on the program staff to collect that. So those examples are just to illustrate kind of how you walk through this process of articulating your data sources as they relate to your strategies and outcomes of interest. And we hope that you will refer to the workbook and think about building this type of data collection framework for yourself in your own program or policy. We are now at the stage where we kind of talk about where are you and where are you going from here. So if you think to kind of what we've walked you through, and if there are those of you who attended the first workshop and are now attending this one, we started with the idea of developing a logic model and having a core group of participants, stakeholders, key players work together to develop this logic model. Then we've got that logic model. It's sort of been agreed upon and approved by the key people. Then as we think about evaluation, we want to clarify the audience for the evaluation and how that evaluation will be used. And Shayla talked about that earlier in the workshop, and we have some content about that and an activity you could go through, thinking about clarifying your audience and how different audiences have different interests in an evaluation. A funder audience might have a different interest from, say, a program staff audience or a participant audience. So again, you want to clarify that. Then you've identified and prioritized your evaluation questions based on the logic model, and you've thought about, okay, we can't do everything, so what will we use? What do we need to know versus what would be just nice to know, and you've clarified that. You've gone through the whole process of selecting your indicators based on your outcomes of interest, and you've gone through the process of thinking about where you need more than one indicator versus one indicator would suffice. You've identified your data sources and you've built your data collection plan. You've done a lot here. And you've considered your evaluation design with the awareness of resources, capacity, and timeline. So you've done quite a bit of work in preparation for your evaluation. But we would argue that you're not quite done. And we would encourage you to generate an evaluation prospectus. This should be a fairly short, straightforward document that articulates some key points of interest related to evaluation. And this is useful either if you are going to hire an external evaluator, work internally on building your evaluation, or if you yourself are going to conduct an evaluation for a client. In all cases, creating a fairly straightforward, fairly short evaluation prospectus with answers to these key questions is a very useful tool. We would encourage you in writing something like this to write it in layperson's terms, to make it accessible to a broad audience, to program staff, as well as to potential evaluators. Again, it depends on if you are the program hiring an evaluator or if you are the evaluator providing this to a program. But again, the idea is to articulate some of the key questions of interest related to the evaluation. And you can put that together with some of the other tools that we've provided, such as the data collection framework. So that's something that we would encourage you to do. And then another tool that may be useful for you to consider is a Gantt chart. And we talk about this in your workbook. But a Gantt chart is really just a visual to help you kind of see all in one place everything that you're committing to do with your evaluation. And this is where, you do this after you've done your data collection framework, where you see kind of what happens when. And one of the reasons that doing it in this way is helpful is because you see you have these sort of bars across certain months. It'll give you a visual of how much you've committed to do in a given month. So for example, perhaps you are saying you'll do surveys and interviews and focus groups and observations, all as part of the same evaluation. And you want to sort of hit people at a particular time in the year, and let's say it's a school-based evaluation. It may be that when you do the Gantt chart, you realize that then that means that you are asking teachers to do many things in May, and you happen to know that May is when you also do your state standardized assessments. So by seeing it all visually like this, it also helps you to be strategic about what data you need to collect when and where you can be flexible based on what else is happening in the context of the program or the school or wherever it is that you're conducting this evaluation. And we encourage you to use some sort of indicator like a star or something to indicate what the deliverables are, where you have something that you have to deliver, whether or not it's drafts of your surveys to the client or to the program staff to review it, or it's the final product. Again, this is just a tool for you as a visual to help illuminate potential issues that you might have in terms of the scope of what you've committed to do. All right, now we would like you to tell us a little bit about what you might have gotten from this workshop. So we've walked you through a lot here, and we'll close out after this. We're going to ask you in just a moment to fill out a survey that tells us a little bit about what was most useful for you with this workshop. But before we do that, we'd like to be more specific and hear a little bit about one thing you've learned or something that you might use and take back to your colleagues. This would also be a place, actually, we have enough time. If there are some additional questions, this could be a place that you could throw in a question, and we can just sort of pause here before we close the workshop and ask you to comment on what's one thing you've learned today that you would take back to your colleagues, one useful tool, one helpful piece of advice that you might use. And then if there are still some enduring questions, this would be a great place for you to let us know what those questions might be. And I'm just pausing here to let folks type. I hope many of you are typing in. This is very helpful for us. We'll be delivering this workshop several times, and it's helpful for us to get some feedback from all of you about what was most helpful, what you learned, how you might use this, and we will use that information as we deliver this workshop in future contexts and for new audiences. So I'm pausing here while you do that. In just a moment, we're going to be taking you to the link to the the survey so you can let us know a little bit more general. So I see Bart is saying that he's going to think more about intermediate indicators. And I remember that Bart was from Kentucky Department of Ed, was thinking about educator evaluation. And yeah, that's something that when we thought about putting this workshop together specifically for an educator effectiveness audience, we wanted to think about the wide range of indicators associated with educator evaluations so that folks can capture data about all the outcomes of interest associated with educator evaluation. Sarah's talked about this idea, improve and prove as examples for formative and summative evaluations. Yeah, I use that language, and at the same time, the prove piece is a little tricky. Improve, prove is useful language. It's a simplification of what is actually a bit more complex, but it is a helpful tool. Anne has talked about using the logic model to develop an evaluation model, enables systematic discussion among colleagues in preparing grant proposals. That's great. And we really hope, one of the things that we hope you'll come away with is the idea that when you're building that logic model, you should be thinking about evaluation. Because if you build a logic model without thinking about evaluation, you'll do what has been done many times before, is you get 3/4 of a way through a program, and then you reach out to an evaluator, and you say, we'd like to evaluate our program, and your evaluator says, do you have data on these outcomes of interest? And you realize that you were never collecting the data, say, on what professional development teachers were participating in, for example. So we strongly encourage you to be thinking about evaluation from the onset. What else do we have here? I remember Donna is from Northern Illinois University, said that using logic models to actually develop the grant proposal, a visual depiction of the proposal and activities, a visual depiction of the proposal, and if activities don't match an outcome, delete it. Yeah, the hope is that the logic model will help you be as logical as possible in thinking about, is there a connection between what you say you're going to do and the outcomes of interest? We certainly encourage you to use logic models as part of the process of developing programs and using them in grant proposals. And more, not only the federal government, but foundations and all kinds of funders are expecting some kind of visual depiction of your theory of action or a logic model as part of the application or grant proposal. So yes, certainly that is important. The model would be great as pre-training for individuals who are responding to an RFA. I recommend capturing it into a standalone professional development module. Yeah, so Pam, one thing we should say is that the logic model piece of this is a separate workshop that is developed and is accessible on our website. If you'd like to, you can actually basically walk through the entire workshop on your own. We're also in the process of building this and having it available, both workshops, as a published product on the IES website, and that will come sometime, I imagine, in 2014. Ginny is developing a better understanding of the difference between outcomes and indicators of those outcomes. That's great, yeah, because one of the things that I have seen in some logic models is they get really bogged down because the outcomes are really indicators. So logic models are sort of not a 30,000-foot view, but they're a higher level view than the indicators. The indicators get more into the weeds. And so one way to think about not getting your logic model too bogged down is to remember that the logic model is not the evaluation plan and that the indicators are doing work beyond the logic model. Let's see, we've got more. Yeah, there was some reference to, I often talk about logic models as set in stone, not fluid. I find a logic model is developed after the proposal and people include it because an agency requires it. Yeah, this is something that we're really trying to push against, is reminding people that logic models are a process and not just a product, and that the best logic models are those that become sort of a living, breathing document for the program and policy. I have seen organizations where the logic models get folded into new staff training, get employed when they think about building job descriptions for people, and really become a living document that's used in multiple ways for a program, and would encourage it. Oh, I'm sorry, Donna was saying that I'm learning to be, Donna's saying I often talk about, okay, so I'm glad that that this workshop is helping to reiterate that. And Jenny is putting in a link to the archive recording so folks can revisit that. With that, these are very helpful. We'll be recording these and thinking about this feedback as we make revisions to this workshop to deliver it again. And with that, we'd like to ask you to be sure that you don't forget to complete the survey. And we'll put the link to the survey in the chat box. And before we lose you, let me just make a few closing remarks and reminders to you. I think we've made this pretty clear that a logic model is a tool for program design, implementation, and evaluation, and can be used in multiple ways and should be, as I've said, a living, breathing document. Again, planning for an evaluation at the onset of program development really ensures an evaluation that is relevant and potentially more rigorous, because then you've been collecting the right data all along. And that's really, I can't reiterate that, or I can't emphasize that enough, that many times when we have worked with partners who want to conduct an evaluation, in the process of talking about the evaluation, we all realize that the data that would be valuable to get answers to the questions of interest just hasn't been collected. So it's really important to be thinking about evaluation early on. And then again, with this idea of the process of logic models and the process of evaluation, that engaging stakeholders, so the key participants, whether or not they're staff people or potentially funders or participants in the program, engaging them in the process of developing the logic model and the evaluation encourages the support and buy-in and increases the authenticity of the evaluation. Because if folks really understand what's being asked and why it's being asked, whether or not it's teachers who are piloting a new evaluation system or program staff for a college-ready program, if they understand why you're asking the questions you're asking, if they feel like they're their questions too, you're more likely to get authentic responses. You're more likely to have people really collect that attendance information or provide that information that you need. So we really want to remind you about the importance of this as a process that you engage. You don't go into your office and write this, but you engage people in it. So with that, I want to thank Andrew and Vicki for today, and Shayla for presenting with me, and all of you for participating so actively in this workshop and giving us your thoughts and your time. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to be in touch. And with that, please don't forget to complete the survey. And thank you very much. Have a lovely afternoon.